Hi, I'm Tom King, the founder of Toolkit.law, and I am excited and honored to be joined by one of the best family law attorneys within our jurisdiction, in my jurisdiction within the United States. I operate out of the state of Texas. In your country, you may call them provinces or regions, but here we call them states. And I'm joined with Sharon Hemphill. Sharon is a board certified family law attorney, and in our jurisdiction, only approximately 6% of all attorneys are board certified. I've had the privilege of knowing Sharon for a good period of time. Sharon, thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you, Tom.
So let's jump right into it. You have prepared a great help sheet for us on family law case intake and organization. Let's go straight to it. Let's look first on the column on the left, the green column. What do we need to know about property evidence?
Well, as you know, property is where it's at in all family law cases. Children and that type of thing, that is extremely important, but let's admit it, it's the financials that really drive the train. Okay, so first off, you have to know how your jurisdiction divides the property. Whether you'll have marital property and then you'll have non-marital property. Sometimes that is called separate property. Now, those two things can be very intertwined depending upon your jurisdiction, because sometimes there are exceptions to one or the other. You have to know your exceptions, and sometimes they can mutate. And so you have to know all the laws about how the property is going to be determined in a divorce. That's extremely important because that's where your financials are.
So obviously different countries will call them different things. In the United States and many other countries, we call it marital property and separate property, but everybody's going to know the terms assets and financials.
Sure. When you start on a new case, it's really important to be organized. And a good way to be organized is to set it up on some sort of a spreadsheet where you can have the list of property on the far left, perhaps, and then across the top. That way you can make entries as to values, dates, important things that you will need in order to get to your values.
Right.
When you're collecting evidence, it's important to determine what category. In other words, within physical property, of course, you have real estate, we call that real property, and then you have personal property. And personal property can even be things like vehicles and all kinds of other things,
Jewelry,
furniture,
right?
jewelry,
Jewelry.
exactly. Everything that is not real property. And then we have things that are neither of those, but there are things that are bank accounts, money, stocks and bonds. So you need categories for all of these, and you need to have them in distinct areas so that you know where to go and how to get your information to plug it in.
And of course, what you're talking about, the term that we use in the United States is how to characterize the property, right? Property characterization.
That's right. And then you can fill in your values, and you're going to need to know, for the most part, what was the date that you obtained each of the properties, even if it's a gift from somebody, even if it's somehow you obtained it through inheritance. We call that gift, devise, and descent. Those are typically terms used for non-marital property because it's typically outside of the marital property context.
You know, I had an interesting case, Sharon, recently in which the couple were common law married, but they weren't living together at the time. And they may or may not have held themselves out as being married or had a promise to be married. Then 3 years, then they got, then they started living together and they celebrated that original date as their anniversary. Then they had to move to Singapore and it required they be married. So they went to the courthouse and they got a marriage license. Now they're getting divorced. Certain property was purchased in between the date of common law marriage, which may or may not have been valid, and when they got the certificate. So knowing not only the date of when you got the property, but what the official date of the marriage is would seem to be just as important.
That's right, Tom. And remember, under most jurisdictions, unless you get a divorce, you can't have another marriage. So generally, you have to be really careful. You may have to go all the way back to that initial, we call it common law marriage. In other words, that's a type of a marriage where there is no ceremony. But it may be valid. And that would, if determined to be valid, then that could make all the subsequent marriages be simply reconstituting that first marriage.
Or conversely, if you're in a divorce now and you find out that your spouse never actually got divorced in a previous marriage, that absolutely affects your status of your current marriage, right? Because you're not
Yes.
married.
Yes, it does, and it may. Now, under certain jurisdictions, such as Texas law, if that occurs, then generally, when that first marriage is resolved, then generally all subsequent happenings in the second all of a sudden become effective. So you have to be careful. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything after that is not going to be considered. It may be considered. So you just have to be careful of the jurisdiction.
Talk to us about business records. I see you have something on business records here in the green column.
Yes. With business records, of course, that's extremely important. First of all, you have to determine whether the spouse has access to or has a right to certain business records. Now, it depends upon whether they own the business or whether they're simply an employee, what rights they have, but generally, regardless, you usually have the subpoena power. In other words, you have the right to certain records generally through an official that goes to the business and obtains the records in court admissible form. And through that, it's very important to get those early on because that's a process. Generally, we have to hire a service to do that is familiar because financial records come under generally an entirely different code section. It's not necessarily in the typical family context. So, but the services that obtain those records, they know the rules. And so it's very good. It's a wise expenditure to do that. Also, as far as business records go, it's very important to remember you can't just add an affidavit onto records that you obtain. They all have to be in, as we always stress, court admissible form, which is a very specific type of format. And so if you're going to do it yourself, if you're thinking about getting records on your own, saving that money, you may find that it's not admissible if you miss one of the specifics.
A question I often hear from clients is, if I'm obtaining medical records, is it a medical record affidavit or is it a business record affidavit because you're obtaining it from the business, which happens to be a medical practice?
Well, that brings up a very good question, because generally we think of business records affidavits. However, when you're talking about medical records, you have to have what we call in the US a HIPAA release. That is a very specific release of medical records, because medical records are protected for privacy. And the person who controls that is the patient. And so people can't just obtain medical records without a release. And so generally, the release is necessary with the business records affidavit.
Jumping down further, we have federal and regional tax obligations, gifts and inheritances, and the topic of spousal maintenance. Can you wrap up these three topics in about 2 minutes?
I'll try. Those are big topics. It's very important always to assess the tax situation. A lot of people have not paid taxes. A lot of people owe taxes. So that is an area you really have to drill down on to find out all the details. As far as gifts and inheritance, that generally would require a specialist as far as tracing goes, to make sure that you identify that it's one party's separate property or not. And of course, you would need the dates obtained, the location of origin, the situation of origin. That's generally when something is contested. As far as spousal maintenance goes, always check the statute for any updates. But remember, you always have to plead for spousal maintenance that is post-divorce. And if you don't plead it, you won't get it.
Okay, we're now going to jump to the next column, and that is evidence regarding the battle for the children, right? What we call parent-child evidence. I was really surprised the way you said it's more about the money. Man, I've been a part of a lot of cases. Maybe I just don't have the same clients as you. But certainly children are a big part of a divorce when they're involved. Let's go ahead and look at your right column, the yellow column, starting with medical and health information records.
Medical and health information records. Yes, very important when we're talking about evidence in a particular case. We have to start early on, actually from intake, to start collecting in admissible form all these forms of evidence. And that would include medical, dental, treatments, appointments, diagnoses, recommendations, so that you're prepared. Mental health records, of course, those would also require specifics and one of the HIPAA releases or the official release that somebody has to sign that gives permission. But even so, mental health records, even if you have that, they might not be released. You have to be very careful that you don't overstep. In regard to mental health records, of course, you have to get the waiver, what we call the HIPAA release or the HIPAA waiver. But mental health records are very particular, even when it's in a divorce, and sometimes especially. You have to tread very carefully, because very often you won't get those.
And there's so much you can also get from educational records, such as attendance, academics, behavior in the classroom, and extracurriculars.
Yes, Tom, that's exactly right. And in addition to grades, the school nurse, as you say, the extracurriculars. But here's a very important point. When you're collecting your evidence in regard to education, find out whether your client has been in contact with the teachers. Are there email exchanges that are following up with what's going on with the child? Have they been to parent conferences? So some of these things won't be in the records, but they may be in your emails.
criminal convictions and records. Obviously, that's important to know whenever you're involved in a family case, regardless of the country you're in. And it's not just for the parents, the husband and the wife, it could also be of the children.
Well, that's true, Tom. However, some people are very afraid because they may have something in their background that they feel would be so critical and could be fatal to their case, but not necessarily. I had a situation one year where the clients came in and the stepfather was seeking to adopt the stepchildren, but he had a murder he had murdered somebody in his background. It
Well,
was
on first blush, that sounds kind of bad.
Yes, it does, but it was when we really looked into it, he was exonerated because it was self-defense, but it sounds really bad when somebody has died as a result of something that you've done. So the point I'm making is you have to look at all the records very carefully. And generally, if it's 10 years or more, in many jurisdictions that won't come in.
Okay. Now, sometimes children will have special needs or have special abilities that need to be nurtured, which may be intellectually, musically, um, athletically. Talk about special needs and special abilities.
Well, special needs are kind of on the opposite of special abilities. When you're
Certainly.
talking about children who are really, really intellectually ahead of their time, and then you're talking about children who have some deficiencies. The deficiencies are very important because now schools and we have we have at this time so many options to help children, and we can determine help children with treatments as far as a lot of these issues. But things that have really impaired education can include uh, many emotional uh, maladies such as ADD, bipolar, oppositional defiance, things like that. And whereas children that are very, very brilliant, they need enrichment. And so these are things that you have to identify and you have to get the evidence on so that when you put on the evidence, perhaps your judge may be able to increase child support to assist whoever is taking care of the children. Now, here's another thing. You have to identify which is the parent that is taking the child to these appointments, which is the parent that is paying for these additional things. So also, if these things are going to come up, make sure you plead for over guidelines child support.
Let's
Most jurisdictions have guidelines, examples on how to calculate child support, but you have to plead if you're going to go for over guidelines.
let's do these last four boxes pretty quickly in the next 2 minutes. Extracurricular and hobbies. Let's start there. Brief comment, please.
Sure. Remember, when we're talking about children, it is all about the money again. And so all these things cost a lot of money, not only in fees to join or fees to participate, but it's the clothing, it's the equipment, it's the transport, it's the traveling. Some of these teams, they go to other cities, other states. You've got a lot of financial obligations. So identify those because you really need to make sure that you include that in the calculus of your child support.
The example I think of, both my boys are Eagle Scouts. They were part of Boy Scouts. Well, you may have a visitation schedule, but scouting doesn't pay attention to your parental visitation schedule. You need to make sure that the parties are committed to which extracurricular activities they're going to support. If they have a certain weekend when they have to leave, that's going to be at the expense of one party's visitation, which may or may not line up with their schedule.
Exactly. And remember, there's insurance, there's all kinds of other related aspects of financials that we often don't think of. So in that intake, you really need to drill down on all these things.
Okay, quickly, abuse evidence.
Of course, abuse evidence will come in many forms. First of all, you'll have witnesses. Very often, you only have the two parties when it's abuse. And so if they have, and if your jurisdiction allows recordings or evidence such as that, you have to make sure that you're not going to be going over any required guidelines or anything that would cause you to have problems. But generally, doctors, photographs, witnesses, even witnesses that your client has spoken with immediately, all the physical witnesses would need to be put to court.
A diary.
Correct. Anything that can help corroborate what
Absolutely.
is.
Let's jump to the second page now as we move on. They can read the others that were on the first page. Now we're on the second page. Again, we're with Sharon Hemphill, and we're talking about family law case intake and organization. And this column you titled Parties and Witnesses. What do you want us to know about parties and witnesses? On intake.
On intake, have your client give you as many witnesses as possible. Give them categories of course, family, extended family, neighbors, counselors, teachers, coaches, activity leaders, mental health professionals. That's a lot. Make sure that they give you the physical address, an email if possible, and of course, a phone number. And make sure that they fill in any information that they haven't given you immediately and follow up with it, because that is extremely important for proving the family dynamics and assisting with any trouble spots. Now, very often blended families may get along very well, but these are for the situations where that does not occur.
I liked what you put in the next two boxes, wife considerations and mother considerations. Explain.
They're very different considerations. Wife considerations includes concerns over what is her financial picture beyond the divorce. And of course, this would go in the opposite way for a husband, whoever is your client. The finances change. After a divorce, things are drastically different financially. And so you have to start getting your client prepared for what is to come. And if you qualify for and can plead for post-divorce maintenance or support, it's very important to get that information in intake.
And of course, this is a generalization, but there will always be exceptions where the wife makes more money than the husband. And then you would obviously flip the approach, right?
Yes, that's what I was explaining in the beginning, regardless of which one is your client. Now, other considerations are completely different because those focus on the children. And there, of course, your witnesses are going to be your family, your coaches, your teachers, activity leaders, health professionals, dental professionals, medical professionals, accountants, all the people that you can line up with the same information, their address, their phone number, and their email address. And
Now,
then
now go into children. What do we need to look at when it comes to children involved in a divorce?
you need to probably start with the schedule and who's been doing what with the children. And from there, you can extend it out for who your witnesses are going to be. of course, the usual family, friends, neighbors, coaches, teachers, activity leaders, mental health professionals, their best friends. Sometimes the child's friends can be the most significant. But you need to start identifying if there are any issues and what are the issues, zero in on the issues and get the evidence on that particular issue.
And of course, someone may be entitled to a maximum visitation schedule, but it may not be practical. If they have, if for instance, in our jurisdiction, if you live less than 50 miles away, then you get 4 nights on a weekend, which means you're picking up and taking from school on alternating Thursdays, Fridays, and Mondays. But if you're 49 miles away, is it really practical for you to do that? So that's also something that people sometimes want to go for the maximum without thinking, do they really want it? Or can they even really do it? Right, Sharon?
That's right. And that's where mediation comes in so handy, because couples or families can do things in mediation that a judge cannot order. They can work out the schedules that are cooperative so that it could be convenient for each party. Whereas if you go into court, very often judges are constrained by statute for changing certain things down to a minimum.
Okay, we're going to go now to the last column. I know there are a few boxes left, but we got to stay on time. You did a column called Desired Outcomes. I love this. Walk us through it.
Sure. The design, you always have to have, what is your goal at the end point? And with the goal at the end point, that is where you really start. So start with the end, start with what you need, what you want. If your goal is going to be awarded the family residence, then start thinking strategically how to make sure you're going to get that family residence.
And Sharon, isn't it really true that on intake, that's when you're starting to prepare for trial and working backwards, right?
Absolutely.
I always
Because
start my exhibit list and my witness list on intake.
that's exactly right. Because you have to know what evidence you have to prove and what evidence is necessary to prove up to get what you want. Now, in regard to the desired outcomes for children, one parent may be the parent that really wants most of the custody or primary custody. But what if you have two parents that want primary custody? Then you're going to have to figure what evidence you're going to need for that desired outcome. And you have to make sure that through the case, your client shows up and is very active and has evidence of all of the participation.
What do you want to discuss about separate property division? Of course, obviously that's going to be specific to the jurisdiction that you're in, depending on the country. But what do you want to comment on the separate property division?
Yes, separate property, depending upon your jurisdiction, you have to be careful because separate property can be accessed under certain situations. For example, if there is physical abuse where the party who is the victim in the marriage has also filed within their pleadings a personal injury case, then the judge can access the other party's separate property. So it's not always protected. And then in addition, separate property during a divorce or during a marriage and after a marriage for personal injuries yourself, such as if you're in a car accident, you get certain damages for personal injuries. Those should be separate property. However, if you lost wages during that particular time, such as if you were out of work because of the injuries that you suffered, and it was for a period of time, the spouse may have a community property interest in those wages.
Such a great point that you brought up about adding a civil lawsuit in addition to the family law lawsuit when it's appropriate to go after separate property assets.
Correct. And
You
it
know,
all has,
yeah.
it all really has to start in the very beginning. You can't be adding something like that very easily toward the end because you might not have the time or the resources to collect all the evidence.
Okay. Child support desired outcome. What do we need to know about child support?
Of course, whoever has the children wants the most, and whoever doesn't have the children wants to pay the least. A lot of a lot of people in various jurisdictions want to try to make sure that the other the parent who has not been the primary parent taking care of the children all of a sudden wants to re-up and wants to start participating so that maybe the judge would not require child support because maybe they could save their money by saying that it's half and half. So you have to watch out for that. However, even if it's an almost equal access or and possession of the children, very often the other parent still has to pay child support.
I've never had a party that has to pay child support. You do the calculation, they go, oh, that sounds low. Oh, that sounds
Right,
low. They
right.
never.
And you have to remember that under the tax code, the person who is generally under entitled to the exemption for the children is the parent who has had the children sleeping in their home or with them one day more than the other parent.
Right.
Now,
And of course
that
that's gonna differ per country, but the
correct,
concept is know what the law says about who gets to claim the children. That's right.
correct. So you have to be careful of things like that. Now, very often parties can agree to change that exemption if there's an exemption, but you have to plan for that right in the beginning.
We have about 2 minutes left to wrap up these 4 boxes. What do you want to cover?
Well, the main thing to remember is you have to start collecting all this evidence at the very beginning
Right at the beginning.
so that you are not caught at the very end trying to collect the evidence because it has to be provided in discovery. Whatever comes in, you have to make sure that the other side has copies of it. You have to prepare your evidence. There is just so much. And that's why divorces very often cost a lot of money because there is a lot of work and effort that goes into it, but it's worth it at the end.
Sharon, this has been great. Once again, we've been covering the help sheet called Family Law Case Intake and Organization. This is Sharon Hemphill, and her contact information is on the help sheet. So when you go to Toolkit.law in the webinar section and you click on the help sheets page, you'll find all of her information on the help sheet. Sharon, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.